I never thought that we would actually get it, but here it is, the true sequel to Persona 5. Not only is it a continuation of our favorite Thieves story, but it is also the final conclusion, seeing our heroes take one final journey of the Phantom Thieves of Hearts to save the world from yet another threat from the gods. But this isn't just an asset flip of the original game, or more the same gameplay you're used to. No, Persona 5 Scramble, the Phantom Strikers, is not only a, for the most part, new story, but is also an entirely new game with different gameplay. But just because the Thieves have returned, does that mean that the long-awaited sequel of differing gameplay is also just as good as its predecessor, while also living up to its own hype? Well, let's find out. Taking place 6 months after the original game, and Joker achieving his true freedom, the gang of friends plans to meet up before summer break is over to go on a road trip adventure. With the introduction of a computer helper AI by the name of Emma, a program much like Siri, the group tries to get all their preparations for the trip ready. Things don't go exactly to plan, however, as while their first day together seemingly goes well, Joker once again finds himself in the Velvet Room where things are not as they should be. Following the disappearance of Igor, with Lavanza being the sole person in the revived prison Velvet Room, and the discovery of new palace-like dungeons called jails, the Phantom Thieves must spring back into action. Starting off with a seductive villainous idol by the name of Alice Higgery, we come to realize while they are antagonistic, the jail rulers known as kings and queens are not purely evil like their palace ruler counterparts. While infiltrating Alice's jail, we meet an adorable, curious, and sweet AI brought to life by the name of Sophia, who basically becomes the game's less overbearing version of Morgana. While taking her into the real world, we come to learn that she isn't able to manifest physically like Morgana was. Instead, Sophia resides in Joker's phone, just a button press away. Upon alerting the rest of the group to what all is going on, the thieves gear up for their latest adventure. After putting a stop to the seductress's seemingly innocent masquerade, we get to meet the professional and seemingly friendly detective Zenkichi Hasegawa, who accompanies the group on their trip after allying up with them. After saying goodbye to Sojiro and Yongen Jaya, the group is off on their adventurous and thrill-filled trip all over Japan, and this is where the game's narrative truly takes hold. The gang will make their way through quite a few famous Japanese cities, putting a stop to sympathetic villains' plans with each location they visit, and while they get further and further, so does a sinister force from otherworldly and supernatural forces. For now, however, let me put a pause on sharing a synopsis of what happens, save the rest for the spoiler section of the video, and tell you all how I feel about the story. Honestly, I adore how the story is set up and unfolds before our eyes, even if this is basically a soft reboot of the original game. Yes, this is more Persona 5.1 than a full-on sequel, but to me, that's perfectly fine. With how the narrative structure of how the Persona and SMT games go, having narrative loops and seemingly reset stories with altered parts is absolutely how things usually play out, and here, with the new elements and the old, it fits together quite well. While I must say that I miss Tokyo, as I am a creature of habit, the road trip setting is fun, although I'll be honest and say that this is as close to the characters traveling as I would like outside the Hawaii trip from the original game, since it shows that the original idea of having the gang world travel would just not work all that well. The idea of having a different jail at each new location offered up a lot of variety and location to how things were handled, along with the fact that there were different local and narrative reasons for each of the jail rulers' corruptions. I love the additions that Zenkichi and Sophia brought as they breathe fresh air into the cast of already lovable misfits that we know and love. Both were mysterious and righteous, and I was glad that while the game did have some unexpected moments with them, it also never really pulled a dumb twist to try and shock you as the player. The story got surprisingly dark at certain moments of the game and delved right into actual horror and mystery. And while I feared for the thieves, I lived for those well done tonal shifts in the narrative. Not to say the game is overly dark or edgy, but it likes to spice things up every now and then, and I appreciated that. Now, in terms of writing and dialogue, I did play the game in Japanese, so in the end, I mostly sped through a lot of the conversations. Thankfully, the visuals and expressions of the characters and situation were able to convey exactly what was going on, despite the language barrier in written and spoken dialogue. Most of the time, the game was just a sweet, light-hearted romp when the friends were spending time together, with only one true anime cliche, that being the bathhouse, which, while a bit of an unfair staple of these games, it doesn't detract from the game, and is overshadowed by some truly standout, laugh-out-loud moments.
Hee-haw! Hee-haw? Hee-haw! Yee-haw! Hee-haw! なんか映ってるし。 バカなことしてないで帰るわよ。
ヒホ、外野がどこ行ってんじゃねえ。
おいおいスカル、お口が悪いぜ。怪盗団ってのはもっとスマートに。だが今は許す。バカバカ。
なんも見えねえ。
Everyone is back. Well, sort of. The main cast, along with Sojiro, are back, along with a surprise character that, well, I was not expecting, really made me smile to see, even though they were in the game for literally less than a minute. All the thieves have grown, but are still very much the characters we grew to love in the first game. If you're expecting to see Kawakami, Tei, Iwai, or any of the other confidants here, however, sadly you will be disappointed. Thankfully, the in-game reasons for them not being here aren't mean-spirited or anything, and they all make sense narratively. The new characters were nice, with Senkichi bringing that fatherly role to the group, Sophia being the group's little sister, and of course the other new side characters were interesting as well, even if there were only a couple of them. Zenkichi's daughter was sweet, sad, sympathetic, and the biggest fangirl, and the mysterious Ichinose joins the gang as an odd ally later on. The new villains were all mostly quite fun. You had the sadistic Alice, a weebish mangaka artist, a shrewd politician, and a few so good, I don't want to spoil them, but they keep getting better and better before they drop off into a major sense of unfortunate deja vu. Needless to say, outside the Heavenly Forces and Ashita Wannabe, the new additions to the cast were welcome, and I had a lovely time with seeing how their stories developed. A lot of people are unfortunately going to think this is a Musou-style game, and that really just isn't the case. Upon first glance, I could totally understand someone thinking that Scramble is just another mindless game where you hack away at enemy crowds, but there is a lot more to that. Outside the usual Persona-styled gameplay of talking with people, selecting dialogue, or receiving text, there are actually new things to do in the overworld, but also a lot less. Gone are side activities, major spots to visit, and things to do individually with your friends. Instead, you now really only get to sometimes talk to them, other people standing around the various locations, and you also get to visit stores for ingredients and restoration items for the main chunk of the gameplay. Since Iwai and Tei are busy during your time in Tokyo, and you're unable to visit them while off traveling on the island, Sophia becomes the new main shop in the game. Sadly, however, while you can upgrade your armor, weapons, and equipment, you can't buy guns. It's a bit of a shame that you can't modify your weapons, but your guns are already the best they can be, so the game does at least balance things out by doing that for you. The game in terms of the social elements is a lot more linear this time around, and for the type of game and story this was honestly for the most part fine. You still spend time with your friends in the game, and you do have the chance to look around occasionally, doing the small side thing here and there. I just wish that there was more motivation to explore the admittedly small new locations. Instead of full-on confident routes and abilities this time, you have the band system, which covers the entire group's stats. Basically, the more you do in game, whether it be combat or hanging out with your friends in cutscenes, along with leveling up the band ranking system by doing the odd thing here and there, you will get points to level up certain skills that aid the overworld and your time in combat and in the dungeons. Basically, instead of upgrading individual stats, you get to boost all your stats with the system, and it was great. You could also boost other things such as persona leveling, personas you find, and how Futaba can help you in combat. There is a whole list of band skills, some taking more points than others to level up naturally, but each skill has a different amount of rankings and different number of effects it will have on you and the group. And although this is replacing major routes, you can still have a bit of a romantic evening with a girl of your choosing. Basically, my one set of advice, always talk to your waifu first before anyone else. While the road trip does take a few hours to get going, it still doesn't really spark the same sense of adventure that being in Tokyo in the original game had. Not to say seeing the gang at different locales isn't fun, as there are some really nice moments, this just confirms that the original idea of having the cast travel the world was a bad one for Persona 5 itself. But the actual combat and meat of the game, naturally this is quite a bit different than vanilla Persona 5. Honestly, it's quite unique, as instead of it just being another button mashing hack and slash, Scramble instead takes on the feel of games like Sonic Adventure, Earth Defense Force, and the Raidou games, along with 2D and 3D platformers, and of course PlayStation era hack and slash adventure games. The game's controls have been switched up from the previous ones, and it will take you a little bit to get used to these new controls. Menus feel quick and snappy, and goodness, they are wonderful, but things like your map, saving, and other things have been switched around control-wise, and if you're coming straight from P5, you're going to have a little bit of trouble adjusting. In combat, however, the controls are like butter. Everything is responsive, and I never had a problem doing the moves I wanted to. Even on the normal Joy-Con controller and handheld mode, which are too small for my massive hands, things still felt good. Before you can get into each of the king's or queen's jail, however, you have to scour around the new locations you have arrived at, asking locals for clues, before finally getting enough information to put into the new metaverse-like app by the name of Emma. Now we get to what everyone was wondering about the most, and that is, how does the Persona style of gameplay translate to real time? And the answer is really darn well, with a few exceptions. Thankfully, nothing game-ruining, but I will bring these up here in a bit. Naturally, you have your melee and rage weapons at your disposal, along with your persona abilities, Joker having any personas he adds to his collection, while the rest of the team have their own personal persona. The core gameplay of taking advantage of enemy weaknesses stays the same, but follow-up attacks are now signaled by prompts, and allow your teammates to perform a heavy blow after you get a knockdown on an enemy. If you don't want to have your allies aid you with a baton press, you can always perform the extra attack yourself. Bigger enemies will have little shields next to their health, and once you break all these and hit them with their weakness, you can finally perform an all-out attack. And what's fun about these this time around is that each character strikes a fantastic pose in the group shot instead of having just a single portrait of the character doing their animation. Another nice thing is the Showtime attack, which you can activate after filling the gauge at the lower left of the screen. This is another fun animation that will play out once you activate it, and if you're battling just standard enemies, this will clear the room entirely. I really appreciate that if you want to save it till the boss, it will carry over if you save it through the battles, so you could, in theory, stack it up 4 times in a row to do major damage with all the characters. The combat starts off incredibly smooth, with equal parts hacking and slashing, along with using your persona, but as the game progresses, more shadows that resist physical attacks start to show up, and this means that you will be focusing more on spell casting rather than actually just slashing your way through crowds, so you will be more often spamming your persona abilities instead of using your melee weapons, but this is typically how Persona games go anyways. This is fine, but I would be lying if I said I didn't miss the more fine mix of the early game. It's not that it drags the game down at all, it just takes a bit away from the game's combo system for your melee weapons. Each character feels incredibly unique, and no one felt clunky or uncomfortable to play, which was a relief. Everyone had their own movesets based on the same combo styles, and along with unique animations for each character, it made each of them feel different from one another. Haru was graceful yet blunt with her axe, Morgana was quick and cat-like, and even made adorable cartoon sound effects while in combat, jumping around or moving. And so on and so forth. Each character's style and feel fit their personality in combat and their moveset. Speaking of the melee system, with that, there is a ranking system called Mastery Skills. You can unlock these by performing certain combos and moves, and the more you do these, the more you will unlock. Basically, the game rewards you for playing in your own preferred style, but you can probably see how this gets shoved aside when personas are required more often later in the game than any of your other weapon types. But on a more positive note, taking out a massive crowd with big strikes or other blows is incredibly fluid and satisfying, and I never found myself getting annoyed with the game, even when it wasn't as melee or gun focused. The guns are also quite a treat to use, as they basically turn the game into a third-person shooter. A thing I loved about the gun combat is as long as you weren't using a heavy machine gun with Ann or Yosuke, you could strafe and roll around to avoid enemy attacks before lining up your next shot. The only problem I had with shooting in the game was that sometimes if I was facing away from the enemy, my targeting reticle would be away from where I wanted to aim, forcing me to take a bit to readjust it. Thankfully, the game pauses until you take your first shot, so it's not game breaking or anything. Another small thing is that the pistols have to lock onto each target, but can miss or hit other targets sometimes. Using the lock on itself also became tricky in hordes of enemies, since if the enemy you were fighting died or disappears for a split second, the weapon would just lock on to another enemy, which could and would screw up your flow in combat. Around the environments, there were several types of environmental aids that you could use against enemies, that would also usually affect their weaknesses, granting you some free damage and another free hit on them. More of these were introduced over the course of the game, and I just have to say that the best ones involve skateboarding or snowboarding. Seriously, the fact that you could race around as Haru or Morgana on a skateboard, smashing through enemies, was incredible, and just absolutely made me smile. I wish there were more of these segments, or the ones that we did get were longer, but they were still really darn fun. Also, yes, you could use Morgana's van form to drive around in, but sadly you could not ride Johanna around as Makoto. so such missed potential, but at least one of the options is there. You'll find all sorts of treasures while exploring the environments, and this gave incentive to explore areas you might not have wanted to originally. You don't need to, but it never hurts you to check what might be around that corner before returning to your goal. While running around the environment, you'll be doing some platforming in the 3D space and on a 2D plane. Both felt alright, but there were the occasional moments of jank here and there where a character might not grab a ledge or do what you wanted them to do, but there was no penalty for falling, and each time was far enough away from the last that it wasn't overly annoying. Also, I like the fact that if you double jumped, you didn't get the ability to air dash, and if you only jumped once into the air, that you could air dash if you need it. I appreciate the fact that there was some balancing and trade-off to your skills. The standard platforming usually incorporated puzzles into it, as side-scrolling segments felt pretty good, also involving stealth some of the time to avoid spotlights. The 2D segments were short, but I still enjoyed them. On the topic of stealth, sadly, while you could hop around to get the jump on enemies by jumping up onto ledges and things, actually hiding around corners like in the first game just wasn't viable or all that available at all in the game. Unlike the original game, to get to the boss fights, you had to run around the level to 3 distinct towers to get 3 smaller treasures to unlock the main fights themselves. These were usually things of importance to the rulers' lives, and it was interesting to see which items you got at each tower. The massive battles before each tower were always a blast, and I appreciated that they sometimes mixed these up by having mini-bosses or having you protect Futaba while she hacked a computer. Yes, Futaba is now more than just supporting combat now, with her actually having a use for the armor you give her. There will be several moments where you must protect her while she hacks away at a computer that is keeping a force field up, which is preventing you from proceeding. Thankfully, enemies don't do too much damage to her if close, and she hacks darn quickly, but that's just because Futaba's the best. One of my only major gripes with the gameplay flow was that all too often, random bits of unnecessary dialogue would be forced in before or after battles, slowing the pace down to a crawl, and this happened a lot. I wouldn't have minded these occasionally, but it happened so often before most battles that it just became draining after a while. Boss battles felt a bit like Devil May Cry light, but please don't think that is me insulting the fights themselves, as I mean that in the best possible way. Each boss has a series of patterns, and the arena is built to aid you without ever making the fight seem cheap for either you or the boss. The only flaws with the boss fights is that on any difficulty but easy, they tend to drag, with your attacks just barely chipping away at their health bars. This doesn't ruin the fight, but I will say that the easy difficulty is all around more well balanced than the other two harder options the game has to offer, at least for boss battles. The major combat itself is just fine on normal to hard. Speaking of the bosses, they all range from decent to downright fun. At worst, they fell in line with what the original game offered, and at best blew the first game's design out of the water with frightening, grotesque, and inventive designs for the battles. However, while the main bosses themselves were always good, there were the pre-main boss fight shadow bosses that were basically just the same weird mechanically bug-like demons that, while having different patterns, were just the same thing with mild alteration each time, and after the first one, I wasn't too big a fan of constantly seeing them. The reason you see them so often is because before you could proceed into the boss fight up the tower, you have to break the seal on the door, and that involves taking out separate targets. The first encounter with them was definitely creepy and interesting, invoking body horror vibes, and it was legitimately creepy, but the rest of them were just a tad bit lacking. After you clear a dungeon / jail, it actually doesn't go away completely like in the original game. Instead, like Mementos, it sticks around so that you can do the game's many side quests, along with grinding if you so choose to. I myself really didn't care all that much for these, as they were just sort of grindy, but the fact that they add more playtime into the game with more side stuff was nice. I was incredibly happy that SP drinks were more plentiful here than they were in the main game, and you could easily buy them in most stores, or sometimes your friends would gift them to you. You could also unlock the ability to buy them from Sophia, or even make your own SP curry if you have the right ingredients. Cooking was fun in concept, but I never really got around to using all the recipes and ingredients I often bought, as I was typically missing only a single piece of the dish that I needed to make it. Although, the first time I cooked what Sojiro gave me was a really great moment in the story. The Velvet Room is back, and while its functionality is basic this time around, the improvements and simplification here are welcome. For starters, what I can tell is that you could basically hold as many personas as you could want to, and after a bit of the game time, also summon high-level personas for a cost, as long as you had each of the required personas for fusion. I never really found a use for the move copy cards you can sometimes find in the treasure chests around the game, and I didn't even realize how to get into the menu housing them until way too late into the game, and I just sort of forgot they existed, to be honest. Although, for those looking forward to the persona collection element of the game, you'll be disappointed, as there is no percentage counter for filling the compendium. There are still a lot of demons to collect and fuse, however, so if you just love that element of the game, you won't be disappointed. I also approve of the fact that, staying in the tradition of the majority of of SMT games, the first demon you catch is Pixie. Just a nice little touch. Instead of safe rooms this time around, there are consoles that you can unlock which just act the same way, although these are a lot less common, probably because each of these dungeons are fairly small and a lot shorter than anything in P5 itself. One of my favorite features here was the fact that you could enter and leave the dungeon as many times as you wanted to, without forcing the next day to happen or anyone getting tired. No, each of the major events takes place over a single day or two, and the day only advances when you advance the narrative. This was incredibly helpful as there was no longer any time limit stress, and it was also a lot kinder to those who want to explore or grind or get any items they might need for a boss or big battle. It was just nice to be able to approach everything at my own pace this time around without having to worry about everything constantly if for some reason things went wrong. After you are finished with each location, you would get a scene of the gang driving to the next location before arriving and setting up the mini story for that area. Thankfully, while it is repetitive, it's not tiring and each location spices things up enough that nothing ever feels too similar. I played the Nintendo Switch port of the game, and honestly, outside of some slowdown near the end of the game and the busier environments and battles, and the lack of anti-aliasing, the game looked and ran quite well. Naturally, it's not as powerful or as nice looking as the PS4 version of the game, but it runs at a solid 30 FPS both docked and in the handheld mode, and things look just fine. Basically how the PS3 version of Persona 5 looked, if not a bit nicer. Also, I should note that the load times are insanely long on both this version and the PS4. It's unfortunate, and while it is a bit annoying, they aren't the worst load times I've ever seen. They are just a bit frustrating since they can take a little bit of time. Still, they aren't always the longest thing, and sometimes they will load snappily. It is just a bit of a bummer that most of the load times are relatively longer than they should be. Let me just say that the cutscenes, both CG and anime, are the best they have ever looked. The new CG action scenes are just a joy to watch with an immense sense of weight to them and excellent directing. Each of these captured my attention and made the action feel incredibly intense and cinematic. The few anime cutscenes were usually saved for the more calm and beautiful parts of the game, where the friends were just spending time together doing fun activities. This, I feel, was a good contrast to the more heavy and full CG action cutscenes. The game was as colorful and vibrant as the original, and while there weren't any new character portraits for the returning cast outside of some slight clothing modifications, the character models themselves have been reworked with a whole new wardrobe. There are plenty of new background characters, and naturally the models for the rest of the main cast look just as good as the old characters. Nothing looked bad, and it all looked like more Persona 5, and this was definitely a good thing. While the new locations definitely did feel new, they still retained that familiarity to them of being back in Tokyo. Also, to note, the game and the entire map is rebuilt from the ground up on the game's new engine, so they really did a remarkable job making everything feel spot on to the original game. There are plenty of various shadow enemy models for the Shadow Special Forces, and of course the Personas themselves. Each of the bosses were their own thing, like I said, with the exception of the weird gatekeepers. I loved every jail dungeon with the major exception of the fourth one, but that's mainly because the puzzles in it were tedious and time-consuming and just plain unfun, and not so much that the design was off, as I actually really liked the overall design of it. Honestly, the designs of each of the palaces were so fun and varied, outside sometimes being a bit confusing to navigate in, that I adored each of the game's stages. Well, until the end of the game, where it basically just became the climb to the heavens from the original game, except a lot more tedious than in the original, believe it or not. My favorite dungeons had to either be Alice's or the neon-lit cyberpunk dystopia. The rest were quite good as well, with there being an ice palace, the Castlevania and Soulsborne-like palace, and a few others that come up. I love the fact that whenever you upgrade your weapons, they would of course change model to fancier and better weapons, which was neat to see your armory slowly evolve. It was nice that there were quite a few weapon designs to gaze upon as the game progressed. Another wonderful bit of attention to detail was as you made your way around the island, the camper van would be filled with more and more souvenirs from your trip. Also to note, Futaba has a Phoenix Ranger Featherman R poster in her sleeping space, which is an adorable detail. Just like the rest of the game, the soundtrack here is equal parts new, old, and some remixed remade stuff for the game. Almost all of the new tracks are amazingly catchy,
それでいいか?
The old stuff is nostalgia inducing.
行くぞお前ら。
やっ
And the remixes are pure bliss on the ears.
誰に言ってんだ切り込み隊長なめんなよ
その息だスカルログハイたちもやるぞ
せや縦ごとぶっ飛ばしてやるぜ
Hearing Life Will Change play once again upon laying siege on the treasure, or hearing the new battle theme by the name of Axe to Grind kick in when you start a battle, just, it's all so top-notch and catchy.
みんなナビを敵から守るぞ
行くぞ
相手を隠したら疾風属性の攻撃で倒せ
行くぞ
But I wouldn't expect anything less from the series. There was only one song I would consider just alright, and it was the one right before the final boss. It's not horrible or even bad, it's just not exactly what you would expect during the boss encounter, but maybe it will grow on me next time I hear it. There's a classical pan flute rendition of Life Will Change mixed in with one of the Palace's themes, and it made me smile till it hurt upon realizing what it was remixing.
見つかったら即織田仏だからな敵が来たら死ぬ気で隠れろ
分かってる俺が死なねえようフォロー頼むぜサクいやナビ
また敵だ隠れて
ちょっとおっかねえなおい
Although, I can apply that to almost all of the game. And if you're for some reason sick of the tunes on offer, the game allows you to customize the experience by letting you change the battle theme to any of the classical previous Persona battle tracks. From the first game all the way up to Royal, which was a very nice touch to include so many other tracks. In terms of voice acting, it was all great, but since I don't know enough Japanese to fully critique it, I will just say it was all fun, sounded good enough, and just overall really solid.
倒して進むぞいけるぞショータイムだ一本痛いそれ元半身モナのスキルいい感じ証を見ろ変身してきた
The voice acting for battle clips or other things was good, and the odd random character voice actors did a decent job as well. Battle sounds such as weapons, enemy attack noises, and death blows sounded like they had weight, and the battle cries and persona noises fit the part, and nothing sounded annoying or grating hearing it for every battle, which is the sign of good sound design. Alright, so we'll be getting into spoilers now, so if you don't want to hear or see them, jump to the timestamp I provide on screen. Otherwise, let's continue on. Everyone who wants to avoid spoilers gone? Good. On we go. Where do I start? Well, let's start with a few moments of meh that happen. The final battle against yet another false god is essentially just Yaldabeth all over again. Not just the fight or the climb up to this new false god, but also the fact that the false god is using Emma, much like Yaldabeth did Eager in the original game, to get their plans done by the thieves. Honestly, the game is basically just, like I said, a soft reboot of Persona 5, and this isn't a bad thing, but some minor things here and there, like an even blander Shido, and several of the bosses basically being more sympathetic versions of the villains from P5 stuck out, but to new players, this won't be a problem. The 5th boss of the game is literally an even geekier version of Tony Stark, including Sentai armor, a mecha suit, and even a lightsaber. I mean, just look at him. He's a tech genius, and his armor connects exactly like Iron Man's suit. I think a part of the game a lot of people were extremely curious about, myself included, was the shadow-looking clone Joker, and the payoff to the scene is as brilliant as it is fun to play. The 4th boss we find out is Zenkichi's daughter, who has become her own shadowy version of her Phantom Thief persona. When you finally arrive to talk to her and change her heart, she spawns her own version of the thieves, having Joker duel it out with his clone. The following boss fight felt a lot like the Virgil fight from DMC3 and was extremely fun to do one-on-one against him. Also, before Zenkichi becomes a member of the Phantom Thieves properly, he actually has a fairly unique stealth section where you control him as just his normal self. A bit clunky, but it was fun to see him and Futaba work together to help free the rest of the thieves. Speaking of Zenkichi, he is a lot of fun to play. His giant guts-like sword and almighty attacks are just incredible, and he was definitely a welcome addition to the playable characters. He also gets an incredible Vampire Hunter D inspired costume. So remember how I said a character from the previous game shows up for like a split second? Well, that character is Sei, who I was extremely happy to see as she comes in to help Zenkichi. Her appearance is brief, but definitely welcome here. The final reveal of Ichinose was expected, but I wasn't expecting her story to be what it was. I was quite happy to see her and Sophia get to go live a happy life together after the world is saved from the false god. The ending is indeed a very solid one, and also very much a bookend to Persona, at least I feel, although I do wonder where Igor is. While it's not as pitch perfect as True Freedom from the previous game, this one feels adult in its own right as the game goes their separate ways, knowing that someday soon they will all get to see each other again. It's just such a satisfying conclusion to all that happens, and it just made me smile and happy knowing that our heroes were going to be more than okay in the end, especially since all the conspiracies against them in the previous game are now completely dropped. With all that said, what do I think about Persona 5 Scramble, the Phantom Strikers? I absolutely adored it and loved every second. While I personally will still say that the original game is my favorite, there are plenty of wonderful moments that rival that game, and Scramble stands right up there with the original Persona 5. Really, there isn't anything I can bash harshly or knock the game down for outside of my mild issues here and there. It's just an incredibly solid game, and a wonderful follow-up and conclusion to some of my favorite fictional character stories. With a lot of heart, emotion, and the never-ending spirit of adventure, this final outing with the Phantom Thieves is one I think any fan, new or old, should take with the gang. It's the perfect game to celebrate summer, and it is just overall a very fun experience that can be enjoyed by anyone. If you just focus solely on the gameplay, you can expect around 15 to 20 hours of non-stop action, platforming, and puzzle-solving goodness, with an additional 10 to 15 hours if you are able to read the Japanese and don't just skim or skip. Absolutely worth your time, and with it being on the go on the Switch, it's quite the game to take with you on any adventure you might be on yourself. As always, if you want to help support the channel, please consider sharing the video with a friend or checking out my Patreon linked in the description below. If you have any comments, questions, or recommendations, leave them down below as I read and reply to everything. Until next time, this is Thierry Williamson signing off until the next video. See ya guys!